Так. Я здесь сам закрою. Уважаемые участники, спасибо большое, что вы...
Distinguished participants, thank you very much for coming back in a timely manner. I did see there were some heated discussions, there were some introductions, meeting new people, and the dialogue continued throughout the whole break. And I was absolutely thrilled to see that happen between the participants. Thank you for sharing your ideas, your considerations about the topics that should have been added to the discourse on Just City, to the ideas on how this concept could be advanced. So thank you so much for your contributions. I would like to say once again that this is just the start of our project, and we hope that there will be many more interesting dynamic events, and the whole process will be as diverse, as dynamic, as deep as today's discussions. Yes, there were some different opinions, there were some clashes between the opinions, people disagree, but that's exactly the precondition for a public progress. Without the clashes, without the collisions of ideas or anything, it is not healthy, you know. It would mean that it's a self-limitation situation internally or externally. So no, we believe that we believe in freedom of expression, or freedom of opinion and dissent. So our second chapter is called Labor, Gender and Identity. So yes, the compilation of these topics, of these words may seem random, but it's not that. We have brought together the topics which are considered to be kind of marginal when it comes to urbanism discussion or kind of urbanistic discussions in our city. In many cities, the gender issues seems as exaggerated or secondary compared to other ideas, to the ideas or problem that we have discussed this morning. On the other hand, very few people can draw a line between urbanistics and labor relations. For that, we have invited experts to discuss the issues and to discuss their attitude to the idea of a just city, not because they have they know the subject and how, but also to express how that is reflected in the city's physical space, physical environment. I'm happy to welcome our participants, Ädil Abilova, expert, economist, SME development specialist, SME and employment development specialist, Timirtas Iskakov, our guest from Astana, a researcher of the city identity, and Khanchaim Jauken, urbanist, a specialist in the field of city planning, urban planning, who will share her vision of gender-sensitive planning of cities. So let's start from the labor relations. I would like to ask my first question to Ädil. Let me start from a very small introduction. At our first event that happened on the 13th of May, the results of which were these developments or these visualizations that we have distributed today. So at that event, the participants of the brainstorm broke into groups and have discussed each their own topic. And the group that worked with the topic of labor and employment actually initially had some difficulties, faced some difficulties. They found it difficult to connect the city, the urban ideas with the labor and employment. And eventually they pulled through. But speaking generally, in general terms, then the discussion on the on labor and the city is actually a discussion about city economy, but not from the point of view of data or economic indicators or KPIs, but from the point of view of a human being. And to that end, I would like to say that we have invited Asil to talk about the challenges related to this topic, whether those are immigration, informal employment, or a famous term as a working poor, a correlation between qualification and social protection, or protection of his or her social, political, economic rights. A gig economy platform. It is a new challenge, but that actually made it very quickly to the heart of our city. And that's not a complete list of challenges that the cities face. And we have asked Asil to come and to talk about these issues and other issues as well. Asil, the floor is now yours. Yes, let me complicate this objective and the task even further and not just speak about the employment and city, but to slightly widen the horizons and kind of expand the boundaries and speak about this issue in the context of agglomeration, Almaty agglomeration specifically. So the city of Almaty is the core city, and there are very close interconnections between the city and its neighboring areas, or kind of suburbia or outskirts. And it's no secret that we have pendulum migration, that we do have people or workers who come from outside of Almaty. There are people who live outside of Almaty, but who come to work. You will have those people almost in every company. And speaking in the context of agglomeration, Almaty agglomeration, then we can list a number of questions or challenges. Those are developments and gaps in social infrastructure. There are some numbers and figures that I have prepared. For example, number of teachers per one student in the city. In the city is 79, whereas the outside of the city core will be 84. If we take number of doctors or medical doctors per 1,000 people, then the neighboring areas that will be 2.2. Whereas we do have the indicator that have been documented in the national project that there's a standard of 4 medical professionals per 1,000 people. So if we talk about the central and outer part of the city, there are certain disbalances and disproportions. So I don't think the matter is only about the outskirts, kind of inner centers of the city. I think it is far more complex than that. At the same time, we also should note the intensity of the migration pendulum. There are numbers that about 47% of all the neighboring areas daily commute to the city core. So I'm talking about the Jambul, Targar, Talgar, elite districts daily, on a daily basis. About 50% of their population comes to Almaty to work here. That's exactly what we feel here. We're talking about traffic jams that might be connected to that as well, different extra burden, extra load for this on the city infrastructures. So on top of that, and besides that, we have a very low level of formal employment that our sector generates. So the issue here is, it's no secret that in business practices, in many companies, salaries are paid in an envelope. There are gray salaries. It's turned into a trend, it seems. So formal employment is another topic for discussion, and it requires certain approaches. On top of that, I would like to speak about the low level of R&D. That youth that's not employed, that doesn't study, that doesn't do anything, actually that youth is increasing, or not NIT, I'm talking about the young, unemployed young adults. So although these are our human resources, this is our human capital. On top of that, I would also like to note another trend. We had a number of surveys and studies, you might be aware about those, that about significant number of professions and specialties that can be automated as of now. And as a result, number of labor resources will be released, will be vacated. Number of human workers will have to be applied somewhere else. So, and of course, the question is, do we support the productivity where we automate everything, where we introduce some digital instruments, or do we want to create jobs and employment? Because jobs and employment, it's about quantitative indicators, not qualitative ones. So if we look at all these issues from the spatial development point of view, then number of issues occur which need to be considered or taken into account when planning, when decision making, and so on. So there is a whole set of intertwined issues, one pulling the other, and therefore a more detailed approach is required. So if we look at the employment places, the points, then there's an opinion that the big share the big attention needs to be paid to SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, which in turn are concentrated according to certain principles. Wherever there are markets, business occurs. Wherever there are consumers, certain service companies are established as well. If we talk about the walking distance venues and objects, these are micro businesses who need employees, who need workers. And of course, they will need a certain infrastructure as well. A certain environment will have to be established. And from the polycentricity point of view, by forming or by implementing the polycentricity approaches, we will form the environment that is necessary for the employees and for the workers, or we need to focus on reducing the migration. Okay, if we talk about the polycentricity, or otherwise we should talk about mobility, we should talk about freedom of movement, the right to move freely and so on. That's normal, that's something that should happen. So there are all these interconnected and related questions, and they need to be a balance respected. We need to consider the opinions and priorities for those specializations which we already have in certain areas, in certain districts of the city. Yes, we already do have a sectoral portrait. We understand that some regions, districts, yes, specialize in agricultural produce. Some regions specialize on certain services. If we take Almaty, then Almaty is a service-based economy, basically. We do have lots of services, and they prevail in the overall kind of economic pie. So to sum up, I do remember the previous session. I don't want this one turn into just the same, but to sum up, this is a very difficult issue that clearly needs to be taken into account in spatial planning, in drafting and developing of new programs, and we have to take into account interests of the business and interests of those who need this comfortable environment. These are my main conclusions. Thank you very much, Asil. Yeah, to add to what you have said, in all of these printouts, the participants have highlighted polycentricity, or city polycentricity is one of the most important aspects. So you mentioned the pendulum migration in the context of Almaty agglomeration, and that is something that's quite applicable to the space inside the city. And the fact how city planners and city authorities plan the development of the outskirts, which are currently very densely populated and which are monofunctional. Actually, that approach produces a very high pendulum migration inside the city. And that creates extra pressure on public transportation systems and in considering also in the absence of good solutions, and also creates pressure for the environment. And going back to the idea of just city, we understand that the longer we look at this issue, the more injustices we can detect and we can notice. And as you know, there's another notion that's called transport poverty that refers back to the nature of housing that's being built at the outskirts of the city. Usually that's super economic class buildings, social housing, and so on. And as a result, people, due to the absence of effective transportation systems, have to spend many hours of their personal time to commute from the place of employment to home and back from home to work and so on. Thereby, missing out on opportunity to develop their own human capital, missing out on opportunity to invest in one's development, one's growth. And a comfortable environment, well, referring to what you have said from the economic point of view, a comfortable environment is the economically active environment as well. It's not only the place where people can live and can move from when they need to access certain services, or go to study, go to healthcare, so on. But actually, it is also a place that is saturated with different functions and different other services. So it's a topic for discussion, I believe. And if Quad is still here, yeah, from Almaty Gimplan, if he's still here, I think it is another topic for discussion that you could cover, Quad. Thank you, Asil. Now let me give a floor to Khanshaim. A question to you is the following. Are our cities gender sensitive? Is the city planning gender sensitive in Kazakhstan? And actually, as a preclusion to that, I would like to note how employment, economic rights, and gender are very closely connected. Well, I'm familiar with Khanshaim's thesis, and I would like to speak about that. I would like you to speak about that now. Thank you. Good day, everybody. Yes, the issues of gender and city environment and urban development of the cities, they are very deeply interconnected. It may seem that it's not the case, but from the start of the city's establishment and from the capitalism's establishment as an economic system and liberalism as a philosophical view, all of these topics have been very deeply connected. So therefore, I would like to start from a quote of a famous philosopher, John Locke. He is considered to be the founding father of liberalism, and he said that the man has the right to life, freedom, and property. But it's, of course, a generalized quote. However, what is missing here is then during the Enlightenment era, he spoke about that, and he actually in his piece, human being was the man, or man was the male, and male was considered to be the neutral user of the cities, a neutral user and consumer of everything, whereas a woman was considered to be the property of a man, and all of her labor, all of her work, and all of her capital that she whatever acquired belonged to men, males. So after the Industrial Revolution and after the issue about city development, city construction has become very relevant due to anti-sanitary and chaotic development that had to do with massive migration from rural areas to the city, it was the men planners or male planners who built and planned their cities from a very male perspective. And then later on, due to colonization policies, all of these practices or kind of they have disseminated and distributed across the world. So what I'm saying when I talk about a male as a neutral user of the city, the males were considered to be the center of the city, and he was a priority, and he was the most important person. However, for women, their movements, their relocations out of the city were not considered at all. Whenever they have developed the subways or whenever they have built a planned roads, they didn't consider these never-ending staircases in London metro subway systems, let alone other needs women may have whenever that women move around the city, that she needs to pick up her child, that she needs to go to work, that she needs to buy food and produce in the shop, and so on and so forth. So, of course, this all refers to polycentricity, to pendulum migration, labor migration from peripheral part to the city center. All of that has, of course, affected the subway, the transportation system, and the way we interact with the city. So when the cities were just built, they also had some zoning rules, and You can see that in Almaty, actually. You can actually track and notice that in all the cities, there's very clear zoning, dividing the city into commercial parts, industrial parts, and residential parts. And that is, of course, very convenient for a neutral user, again, for a male, but it's not very convenient for a woman who has lots of responsibilities, lots of chores to run, that she looks after the house, that she looks after the home and the children. That is very natural for our culture and to be carried by a woman. Then these needs are not considered when planning this kind of zoning or and also when organizing transportation system. As a result of the zoning, a further segregation has happened, and women had to stay at the periphery while males could stay in the city center. And it was very difficult for women to spend time and to find time to promote her human capital, her financial independence.
Now we can easily track that in statistics. For instance, look at the statistics of salaries, the gender gap in the Republic of Kazakhstan. In 2020, the difference between the genders was that a woman gets paid 33% less than a man. That's average for Kazakhstan. The reason for this gap in the salaries, first of all, is the childbirth, first child. So until then, economic situation of men and women is the same. After the first childbirth, her salary drops very seriously, and it can be seen in statistics of any countries. But the problem, I believe there are many problems, many factors that are at play here. But one of the factors, I believe, is that our cities and urban environments, from the time of construction of cities, simply were not adapted to multifunctionality of women. And later on, even now, this has serious effects on economic independence of women. As a result, women become owners lesser, they rent and they live in the worst and dangerous living conditions. Very often households led by women are poorer and as a result cannot afford savings with the same speed as households led by men. Women are very often excluded from official housing programs and they very often don't have time or skills to build their own home. These are statistics from studies made in many countries of the world. So what are the solutions here? You can see great solution paths in this poster. I believe that ways of solution we can do in the second round. Sorry for interrupting. Thank you very much, Hanshaim. Now, I will also leave my comment for the second round to complete the first part quickly and give the next floor to Timirtas. Timirtas, your question is how urban identity and its attitude is defined by cities' fairness. But before you start responding, could you please simply explain for the audience what do you see as the notion of identity and what does it have to do with our today's discussion? Hello, everyone. Speaking in a wider sense of identity, identity means how we compare ourselves to smaller or larger groups. What are we when we ask ourselves? And we start answering this question, we basically say we characterize our identity. When we speak of identity in the urban context, to the question, what are we also add the question, where are we? So when we say city and identity, there are confusing notions out there. Theoretizing, they divide them. There is the notion of urban identity, which is how urban residents perceive themselves as residents of a specific city, this city. When you ask yourself, okay, I'm a urban citizen, what makes you Almaty resident? And people may ask themselves, what does it mean to me that I live in the capital? And how do I relate to the city? And the second term that exists, so that was urban identity. Now, city identity is somewhat different. City identity is how we perceive the city, not ourselves in the city, but the city itself. What does it mean for us? It's an interesting notion because for every resident living in a given city, they always have their own city, and they actually have two. They have my city, city that an individual sees in the course of their life, they perceive it, and they have this abstract notion of a city, our shared space, and what are the values they have in these words. And there is a third term that researchers identify. It's called identity to the city. So it's more of a psychological construct that tells us how we feel in the context of this city through our personal biography. And I think that this term of identity to the city, many of us have faced this. When you write your biography, pictures come up to your mind as to where you went to school, where you worked, where would you go for walks, and all these memories form this identity to the city. And why do we generally speak of identity and fairness of a city? Seemingly, these lyrics, and here we are speaking of physical spaces, roads, economy, labor relations, and what does identity have to do with it? And the notion of a fair city in the context of city, I would say that a fair city provides equal opportunities for all residents of that city, letting them feel part of that city, realizing their right and use that right and do so through preserving those places that they associate with that are dear to that individual. So forming this cultural layer in the city and being part of the city. A fair city provides equal opportunities to people, irrespective of them being born and raised there or they're have moved here. Do they live in the center or in the outskirts? Fair city is for a central resident, it will be one identity. For those in the outskirts, it will be different. But the persons of the city center must identify their rights to the city and understanding that city knows and cares about this individual. And if that happens, then it happens thanks to the presence of this shared identity as a collective and of different groups, communities. And we see this when city residents, for instance, who consider themselves to be simple users of economic service in the city. So they work, they go to restaurants, but they don't participate in the improvement of the city, in solving its problems. And when they clearly understand the question and clearly can answer, what am I? Where am I? And where's the city? That's a positive point in person's identity. They become a citizen, a proactive resident who works on improving their city. And when we speak of physical space of a city, how it forms our self-perception. And there are many factors you can look into different categories, but generalizing this, I would speak of physical spaces, factors that form in Kazakhstan identity of Kazakhstan cities and identity of the city's residents. That's how urban planning is done, how gentrification is done in the cities. how the work is done with legacy, heritage, historical memory, collective memory, and presence of this cultural code, cultural fiber, tissue, if you will. But it's a very important notion because when we ask ourselves, why do we pay attention to identity when we need to decide who are we? Should a city form an image of an ideal Almaty resident? So when the person comes, lives for a fortnight and wants to become Almaty resident, when we start discussing this, it's important to remember that this is generally about the way we see ourselves as a community in a wider sense of that term and extent to which we are ready to recognize ourselves, each other. Thank you very much, Timirtas. Can we say that the talk of identity is needed, among other things, for the residents to obtain subjectivity, that they feel their role, their significance in the city context, thereby talk of identity can incentivize engagement, civil participation. Yes, most definitely, because even at the coffee break, we were discussing cases of conflicts in the city where there's social tension, using the example of Almaty and the capital city, Al Astana. It's obvious for me that working with colleagues in Almaty, my area of expertise is protection and popularization of historical and cultural heritage. And in this connection, it is obvious that this issue of identity, how it's formed, and what needs to be done so that people feel part of the city. It's very important. It's not just lyrics. It's a major mechanism, resource in the future because in Kazakhstan, average age of citizens is 30. And the way these 30 years old young people, how they answer, what am I, what is my connection to this place, and how does that place perceive me, better understand problems. There are many problems, but this citizen will not run away from these problems, will not try to self-isolate. And it's very important because the more there's such identity, when there's a legacy of these identities, urban culture, which is formed in parallel with this identity, then civic activism and generally adequate urban planning and management, because managers and decision makers are the peoples who come from this environment. They have this city identity. Your best mayor will be person who knows the city, loves the city, knows of its problems, and understands that they will live there, and it's their personal choice because they have this strong city identity. So I believe it's a very important point because the cities that we live in will very much depend on how we answer this question. What are we? Yes, question, what are we? And I believe we'll come back to this in the process of discussion. And the second round of our discussion, I'd like to build around one question to all of our speakers. What are the solutions you see in solving this range of problems that you have outlined? Because every one of you has mentioned where we see injustice within the framework of each one of your competences. And now let's talk about solutions. And I'd like to give the floor to Han Shaim because she was actually ready to jump to that subject, please. Yes, thank you. Like I mentioned earlier, the very process of establishing cities, the way they were built, how a man is a central nucleus and a neutral user of these cities, as it's presumed, and it was happening for so many centuries from the time of building cities. And I believe that for systemic problems, core problems that impact many areas of our life, from salary to health to labor to economy. Interaction of the city with gender is such a systemic problem. Yes, that it's great using things such as lighting, alarm buttons, aesthetics, visibility. That needs to be done definitely, but the core system will not be cured by that. And to cure that core reason, which is built in the system itself and in the structure of every city on earth, it will take more systemic suggestions, solutions, and proposals. And here they're mentioned, which is representation of women in local governments. Yes, most definitely in the Republic of Kazakhstan, there's 27% of women out of 100% participate in the Majlis and Senate. Only 27% in Akimats and other places where decisions are made, where problems are solved, where master plans are prepared, or general master plans for urban development prepared, different programs like 2030, 2050. We need to have more women there, because even if you ask yourselves if they would suggest to reduce a sidewalk in some street, if there will be out of 10 people, 5 are women who make decision about reducing or shrinking that sidewalk, I'm sure they will stand for it, because they'll understand how do they feel walking on a narrow sidewalk with a stroller, with a child, and endless shopping bags. Or when the question is raised, how should the system of mass transport organized in the city? Women, of course, will take into account needs of other women and will understand how it is for them to exist in an urban environment using that mass transit. And then in they will be making decisions that will respect these needs and will not set a man a priori as a neutral user of the city as it was done for many centuries. So it's a kind of a thing that is so deeply engraved in the system of capitalism and liberalism and in the very construction of cities. Yes, short-term solutions such as alarm buttons, that's important, but it is a lot more important to make systemic changes in the very structure and address this core problem. Thank you very much, Khanshaim. Asil? Yes, Adil, if I can continue about the thesis I have expressed, they're applicable within the city. True, our 8 districts of the city, they also have disproportions in infrastructure and many other indicators. Let me just give you a simple example. Almaty and Bostanlık districts, Medeo district, these are the districts where there's a high concentration of business activity, where there are a lot of jobs. With that, our workforce, our specialists who work in these companies, they live in residential areas. They may be somewhere in the outskirts because availability, accessibility of housing in the center, rent is so high, and they they live from somewhere else and they need to commute to their jobs and back. So speaking from perspective of solutions at this time, it's very important we all understand that there are economic plans of development where we develop certain industries of the economy with subsidies, with different support measures, and so on and so forth. Yes, there's a room for development. It's very important for these things to be harmoniously, mutually integrated, taking at least into account the things that we have already formed. Well, just example from business perspective and labor, we have historically, evolutionally developed places of concentration of business. Let's say, just take a bazaar business, same places where people work, and it's a certain number of people working there daily commuting to do their jobs. And with that, we need to take a note that it already is, well, you can't really call them a cluster, but it's an already established uh, high economic activity district. And there are such places. Take our business centers of, let's say, Nurlatau, where there is a concentration of different businesses. So there is a specialization on economic activities in the city. And I believe that in planning spatial development, different elements of our city, if all of that is taken into account, then it will only give us synergies and will give those positive results. And in turn, we need to add the important point that if we consider labor business as place of labor, for business, it's important to be profitable because it's a business. When business and residents are different, they need to make money and they need to live for that.
Well, another thing is that in our city, we do have a high share of individual or sole entrepreneurs. And that means that those people, they wear two hats, they're entrepreneurs and they're city residents at the same time. Oftentimes, entrepreneurs do not identify themselves as a separate subject of business. They don't actually take off or wear, put on those hats. It's like combined, two in one. Oftentimes, as a result, we have a mix of what is it that I want. Whatever I want is I want as a city resident and also as an interpreter. Both are important for me. Let me give you an example. There was some polls, and whenever you ask a question to an individual entrepreneur as to what kind of needs you have, what kind of difficulties you have, what kind of problems you have, they don't just express their needs for business or for business development. They express the needs that they need as a resident, like there's a lamp pole doesn't work, that there is no pavement, the sidewalk isn't taken care of, the parking isn't uncomfortable, and so on and so forth. So all of these issues are interconnected. And if we talk about the city and the work and the employment and labor, then of course, and the approach, considering what we have, considering the economic plans of the city and the regions that we're very closely connected with, maybe there's some strategic plans that need to be also built considering all of these. So another thing is that this is a bilateral kind of movement moving towards each other, and a certain mutual commitments for the business towards the business need to be taken as well. When I'm talking about commitments, creating the high quality employment environment or creating social guarantee for the employment. So these measures need to support. We do know that the state actually does have certain support measures for the entrepreneurship. And I think the entrepreneurs could also come up with some counter, commitments. However, the key here is that it needs to be synchronized and it needs to be adapted to what we already have. Thank you. Thank you very much. Interesting that the solution that the participants have proposed are of systemic and financial thing. Timothy, do you have just the same approach in the context of identity, or is it more of bottom-up approach? I think the answer is sort of ambiguous. If we are to answer the question of what can we do in order to, so people didn't alienate and so that they could feel as a part of the city, that they could feel their right to own the city. I'm talking about that's about the small, big cities like metropolis. However, when we talk about the small cities, actually the problem for them is different. It's a migration when people leave the cities, move to the bigger cities, larger cities, or they leave Kazakhstan altogether. So to avoid that alienation, to keep the people stay in the city, to make them and to kind of encourage them stay and live and be happy, then things need to be done. And speaking systemically, then we need to engage people, then we need to bring them on board, we need to ask them what they want, what's important, what's of value, what's dear to their heart simply, and not just listen to them, but also to take into account what they say. if we are to talk about some changes, then physically, if we talk about the different space where identity is formed, then the main here would be the reform of the policy. Policy decision making, the policy of planning, the openness, where the decisions could be taken not independently or by individual officials who just, drew a new block on the general plan and who decided that, oh, these houses that were built back in 1950s no longer worth living in. We need to build some new development projects and so on. So these kind of solutions are usually taken in a desk manner, inside the offices. And I'm not talking about adding any public opinion. Actually, some decisions are taken without consulting the experts, let alone bring on board public. So I think the key here, the cornerstone of the whole thing, is to ensure openness, transparency, and to engage as many stakeholders as possible in decisions on how the city needs to be planned, to bring on board experts, to bring on board the people who understand this whole subjects of identity, architectural code, or cultural legacy, or cultural institutions. So all these experts, they need to be brought on board, and the whole discussions need to take place. When we also talk about transparency, then of course we talk about the gentrification, for example, in the capital city. Gentrification is the item in the budget that eats a lot of money. And city authorities report about the numbers of square meters of new housing or children's playgrounds being gentrified and built and so on. I mean, they talk about the numbers, but if you ask about the quality of that housing, if you ask about the way it's been built, if we ask about the collateral damage when building those buildings, or if you ask a question about the children's playgrounds and so on. So if we start analyzing this qualitatively, then we see and we find out that everything happens in the city center. And the residents of not city central areas do not feel as if they belong to the city. They're disconnected, they are disregarded, and they are on their own. Actually, it's a big risk, because an alienated people, they feel like they're marginal, and such people are unpredictable. And to that end, of course, we need to reform the system. We need to improve the quality of planning and quality of gentrification, of symbolic development of the city. Identity of these districts needs to grow and develop on the basis of these people's contributions and stories. It shouldn't be like you come to this outskirts of suburbia, just demolish everything and put new houses instead. No, you cannot do that, because as a result, you will get rid of the whole potential, all the capacity that the whole district had. And that way, the people would be deprived of this space that's no longer there. Another example is when we say that identity varies or differs, and I mean, for any city too, but actually you can feel it particularly strongly in Astana. There are people who live in this district, in particular district, like Old City district in Astana, and they have never been to the left bank of the city, to the new city. And for them, renovation, when the official comes and say, we're gonna demolish your cities, and we're gonna put you out there behind Jala or behind Chantatar, they feel like they're being expelled from the city. They feel like they're being moved to places where they have never been before. And it's a disaster, it's a catastrophe for them, it's a trauma. I think it's actually akin to trauma when that 200,000 people suffered when the capital city was moved to Astana. They lost their identity, they lost their memory as the resident of the city. Said, your city, your Astana, Tselenograd is a bad one because we're going to build a new capital city here. So I think we need to avoid that kind of alienation. We need to avoid that kind of difficulties. So whenever it comes to reforms and planning, we also need to consider the mindfulness, because whatever we do, the goal number one should be the good goal. we as activists, as experts, as people who write programs, who participate somewhere, we must understand who we're doing it for. And this empathy towards everyone, you know, humanization. And needs to be there. Also, when we work with the legacy, we sometimes go and say, okay, this is a beautiful city, we need to maintain it. But at the same time, there are people who newly came to the city. Maybe they came only 5 years ago, but they still have the same rights. They have the right of accessing those cultural institutes and so on, even if they are not like those who want a beautiful city. So I think this empathy, this acceptance characterizes the maturity of the city. When we don't segregate, when we don't break into ours and them, but we all see ourselves as all residents, diverse though, of the city. Thank you very much, Demirtau. I think it's time to accept the questions from the audience. And then we might have time to wrap up, I think. I think it was Muratbek who asked this question first, then it was Sector X, and then Christoph. Hello. I would like to ask my question in English, but you can answer I can answer this question in whatever language you prefer. So here's the question. You asked, what can be the decision, what can be the solution for these questions? Lately, I also actually concluded, I arrived to the same conclusion, actually. Before January, I had some interest in urban development, urbanism. But during January, I've noticed the following. People, whether in a small city like Zhanaozen or this large-scale city is Almaty, everywhere, they had this main demand, one demand, to vote or to elect the mayor. They don't even care the parliament or the government. I think it looks at the election of the local mayor concerns people the most. And I think the reason for that is that any problem, whether that's city development, urbanism, or environment, and civil society does different studies and surveys and so on. They propose and offer different ideas and recommend it. They offer it to the mayor. Anyway, the political decision maker rules sort of prevails and depends on what he or she decides. So I do believe that we as civil society representative, whether we're gender activists or environment activists, we must find a way to participate in political decision making and to influence the political decision making. We should stop being the advisors or the consultants. I think we should aspire to become the political decision maker. I don't know what mechanisms we can there, whether we need to do it through demanding the election of mayors, or there's some other ones like Maslihat, local council, members, for example, are being elected, or you can be elected as a district level, as mayor of a district or maybe village. So I think we need to aspire, we need to try to become the people who will make the political decision. Maybe that's the core solution, because whatever problem we have actually is obstructed by this particular fact. And it seems that civil society is still at the level of an NGO. I think we need to rise, to higher political level. I think in Western Kazakhstan region, the residents of one village have paid themselves collectively to build the road. It had to be done by the municipality. But actually, they had to do it themselves because there wasn't any on the road. The municipality wasn't going to do it. So they did the road, they paid for it, but they've been penalized for that. How can you understand that, given that this situation happens? Because ultimately, whatever you do, no matter how hard you work, it all gets stopped by the political decision makers and their political will. Muratbek, who did you address your question to? All of us? Okay, thanks. Let's take a few questions at once and then try to answer them one by one. Anwar, Sector X. I have a very short question. I've heard the experts mention two main problems: traffic jams and grievances or ignoring the gender aspect and sensitivity in city planning. We already spoke about the development. Do you think we can address the traffic situation by borrowing the example of Turkestan. The university of Hoja Ahmed Yusevi has been built there, and the city that wasn't known there now began developing because it became the tourist attraction. There are many universities in Almaty. People or students come here to study, and they are the ones who create and contribute to demand for the housing. And I think that's another problem that we do have. So I didn't quite understand what's the connection with Turkestan, what to do. Why can't we address the traffic jam problems, doing it similar to what Turkestan has done, to move the universities to the other regions, so maybe to outside of Almaty, and then those small cities will develop, relocate universities, okay, and then taking the burden of the city. Okay, please, Ajat. You were next. I have a comment rather than a question. From the start, I've been listening to your presentations, especially the presentation of the Ädil Qala project. I work with the concepts such as human rights, capitalism models. And my proposal to all the participants is the following. We need to justify all of our positive and progressive views. Well, there are certain concepts, and the main concept is the human rights. It's the core, the cornerstone. I do agree with the moderators and everyone, but we do not quite understand this concept. We don't quite know, and we're not quite familiar with it. We talk about gender, we talk about socially marginalized or disenfranchised people. Those are all human rights, and they are all justified. I'm not talking, they're not the Constitution, but we have them. Okay, let's take them by default. Will be a universalist, universal human rights concept actually tells us that we do have human rights because we're people. No one has to give them to us. This is ours, it belongs to us. Democracy is a human right. Let's take the right of the child, right? Right of the child. Let me give a specific example. There's a convention on the rights of the child, and there are 5 principles. The first one is non-discrimination, second one in the best interest of the child, the third one is the child's right to life to development, and the last one is inclusion. All the children must be covered, must be included, no child left behind, so to say. And all of them need to enjoy their rights. I think all the problems of our city can be addressed simply in the context of the child's rights or of all these 5 principles. In every court instance, we can appeal to these concepts. So a specific example that I mentioned, a refugee from China who fled persecution has received a pretty interesting decision and ruling of the Taldykurgan court that she could not be deported, so that she was a non-refoulement case actually, and she illegally crossed the border and so on. But for the first time ever, the court in Kazakhstan has referred to the convention on the right of the child, and that the child had the right to mother, child had the right to be free from violence. And actually, we, as a result, now have this absolutely extraordinary case. Why can't we defend our right to the city, to the proper, adequate, fair, just city, whatever, in the context and referring to the convention, the right of the child? Actually, goes same to the child safety and traffic jam and so on. And the second is capitalism. The rent-based capitalism is a huge. It's an elephant. It's a huge elephant in glassware shop. We can't see it quite yet, but it's there. Can we not do this as Sweden? Their capitalism model is slightly different. It is social oriented, a social model. In Almaty, actually, any piece of land is about $2 million, $3 million. And we need to discuss the Kazakhstani model of rental capitalism, where all the land and sometimes the air is modified, is commodified, is actually commercialized. We need to discuss that because we need to protect the concept. Then only we will be able to defend and protect everything that we have just said. Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, I try to keep it brief, but thank you so much for the valuable contribution so far. It's incredibly interesting, and I believe we made one gigantic mistake ending quite soon. We could discuss this probably till the late evening. But one point I want to raise, and I wanted to raise this with the first panel already, but I try to link it to this. When I think about justice, about governance, about gender, about labor, about identity, one concept and term we haven't touched yet and we're missing, it's power, right? Let me briefly explain. I believe we need to acknowledge that there is different access to power resources, right? And what's power in cities? And I was thinking about this the whole morning, essentially, and 3 brief examples. It's obviously decision-making power. Who's calling the shots in the city? Who's deciding what road to build, what institution to create? It's financial power. Who has the money to invest? Who has, that side of the story? I mean, decision-making power so far is the state, right? The people and the state, sure. Financial power is the rich, the investors, also the state. And then you have the power of discourse. Who's driving the conversation? Who's, creating the narratives that sort of inform how we perceive our city? It's also important. But I would be interested if you could briefly touch the link of your respective topic and power, because I believe, take gender as an example. All of what you said, I would fully subscribe to what you just said, but link it to decision-making power and how other people, if you could briefly, touch this, I would be incredibly interested in your opinion. Thank you.
Спасибо, Christoph. Actually,
thank you, Christoph.
Said in the recommendation section, it was about power and decision making.
Спасибо большое. Ну, во-первых, я хочу сказать, что вот мне очень нравится.
Thank you very much. I very much like the name of the project because we in the Public Council in the Almaty Development Center have been discussing for a long time how is Almaty as a dream city, comfortable city, but fair city. See, it's a simple notion on the very surface. And I think we need to promote it very strongly so that people will understand that we will have fair city. But for the city to become fair, I agree with every speaker of this panel that we need to create meanings for that justice. When we say fair, when we say justice for everyone, I'd like to criticize your poster for the word city and gender. It's not, these are the ideas of residents. And you see, we are dividing men for women. City has to be safe for everyone, for every citizen. Why should we exclude men? We need to very strongly speak of the meanings. Meanings take long. These are changes that are slow in this, and there needs to be a discourse, the likes we're having here, for the whole city, so that people who come to Almaty want to become Almaty citizens, they want to join in the discourse, let them also speak up, let them say what kind of fairness, what kind of justice they want to see. These are long-term goals and investments, but there are low-hanging fruits as well. Damn capitalism, right? Taxes. And you know that citizenship in many countries, before women received economic political rights, rights were defined by who pays taxes, and that's an important factor. I know that many people who come here to make money, they simply don't pay taxes. They have no connection to the city, other than they just come here to make money. But when they make those taxes and they can say, I want to have a sidewalk here or something comfortable, they will have every right to demand it. Those who don't pay taxes, they don't care. So it seemed to me that we need to build a long, short, and midterm strategies, but we should speak of this not by just saying it's just a measure of sanctions by taxes. No, we should say you, everyone of you, every Almaty resident, you invest in your city by paying taxes. You're making the city more fair, make it more comfortable for everyone. Thank you very much. We understand your thought as well. But on the other hand, a person, in any case, should be entitled to what you have listed. They should have that right either way. Right. I wanted to pass the floor to our speakers for final summary. Muratbek here mentioned political. So first comment of Muratbek and Christoph, they, I think, resonate. And I believe our speakers have also spoken of that, that the need for political participation is an important instrument and condition, and openness, on the other hand, of the system to, when they say you can start with yourself, that's also a two-way street. Political system should also start with itself and be open to other opinions and be more open to considering interests that may be different, that may go against the interests of the executive branch of power. So please, your comments regarding political power and political involvement and attitudes to power, conceptualization of the right to the city through universal human rights, and generally the notion of rights to the city. It's an aggregate of rights, economic, social, environmental, and others. And there was also a comment regarding decentralization, spatial decentralization in a scale of the country. So moving centers of attraction through different regions. Please, I think I didn't forget anything. And Aida also had a comment on how we engage people through what, and as one of the tools is tax burden as a way of making people participate in decision making or incentivizing them in that. Please, Asil, I don't know who will start, or Khanshaim, Timirtas, whoever wants to pick it up first. Yes, in fact, there's a lot to discuss and we can really talk for much longer. But speaking of some key points, I think specifically the dimension of city and labor, I have to say that on the other end, there's an employer which is a business and has own interests, and they need to be taken into account because majority of them are the same residents, maybe even more than other residents. They have more capacity to become those proactive people who can make their contribution in the development of the city. Now, from the perspective of political solutions, I think in this dimension, in fact, our state is participating actively in supporting business, and there are many programs for that. There are different grants, there's support of SMEs and micro businesses, there's a roadmap for business. As far as I know, there's a second program already in place. There are roadmaps for employment. Many things, in fact, if you study international experience, actually quite a lot is being done for business. There are a lot of initiatives out there. And I simply studied these programs myself in decision-making. Many things from the perspective of business environment, entrepreneurial environment, these things are considered. Now, when it comes to spatial development, I believe that all of that, and when in previous part I spoke of the need to provide certain things, I think all those things are interrelated. In any case, one way or another, if we speak of labor, it has more of a regulated area, labor code, other laws, and so on, where certain rights and things that an employee can claim are regulated in accordance with different international practices and norms and so on and so forth. And I think all these things are generally provided for, and we already have some basics for that and pretty good ones at that. So we're not starting from scratch. We have a very good ongoing basis from the business perspective. Of course, there is no limit to perfection, especially now when the cycle of changes is very fast, when things change rapidly. One really has to keep their hands on their pulse and quickly adapt to the situation. This is all from me. Well, summing up and going over the questions that were raised, speaking of identity, where we include fair gentrification, fair planning, preserving legacy, uh, creation of cultural institutions where there will be fair access for all citizens. Here we always have this nuance that when we speak of power, a driving force for a reform or positive change to take place. In Kazakhstan's practice, it was always waiting for the Akimat to do something. There has to be kick from the bottom. So there has to be a public outcry or movement that struggles for a very long time and very hard. And then decision makers start scratching, start inviting people, uh, this including the citizens, to engage them, to change things, to do something, or a kick from the above when this political instrument becomes engaged. And we all perfectly know about that. Unfortunately, it is so that these two tools, well, for us, for city residents, as people of the civil sector, people who live here, are doing our research here, of course, we have more possibilities to speak of the problems, and we need to speak about them. We need to come together, and this discourse needs to keep on growing. Maybe it will not bear fruit in the next 3 years, but generally, the more we engage people in this agenda, speak of these problems, say that it is very important, I am confident that we will gain these allies not only among regular citizens, but among those decision makers one way or another. Now, political instrument is truly such that there's a point of growth in the civil society. Critical mass is growing, but we cannot simply say that we should do everything ourselves, improve ourselves, and the political instrument, the system that is also to blame for what's happening or for things that are not happening, that it should stay. No, it should change. But how it will change, that's a big question as to who should launch these changes, true changes that we all want. Because for me, estrangement or this disappointment of the society in the city, in one's own country, this crisis of identity, when you give up. You see, when that happens, and I think it's the same everywhere for all cities, when there is growing recognition, this picture, this narrative, the official narrative that you get from the city administration or the government, when it's different from reality. And the situation, speaking of identity, is such that, for instance, in Astana in recent years, this identity that was projected from the top was positioned, was branded by that it's a city of the great step and it's a capital of the great step. And I, as a citizen, very much like to feel in the capital of the great step. But when we see implementation of that, we see daily the step or step lakes are being filled in, and how the political leadership of the city doesn't do anything to stop this lawlessness. And there is a critical mass of citizens. People speak of this. They have court rulings, but all of that doesn't seem to work. And what needs to be done for it to work? I have no ready-made recipe, but at least we should continue speaking of our values. We should promote them. We're all very different. We have different values, but for us to be heard, we need to speak of this. Yes, I very much started thinking about the question about the relationship with the power, political participation, and as to who is the person or the group of persons that make decisions. In fact, in our system, in majority of the countries, it's democratic representation. So we are not living at the times of the Athens of ancient Greece, where everyone would come together in an amphitheater and with democratic participation, where we would shout out our opinions. Now the sum of the population is so high in every country, in every city, that you always need to elect who will participate in the decision-making process, who will have this power. And I believe this tension will always be there. And then the question about who pays taxes, who should have the right to democratic participation. Even if you come to a golden standard of Athens and ancient Greece, even there, people who could make decisions and who participate in that democracy were only men, free men, not slaves, and they must have been a landowner. The same existed at the times of feudal Europe. And even now, the question of migrants, illegal migrants who come here or from, let's say, from Syria, and they live, let's say, in Germany, where they have no rights because they don't pay taxes. But we already had this tension from the perspective of gender, where women for a long time were not paying taxes and were considered to be property of a man, and men would pay taxes at the time. So we have already been through this talk, and now women pay taxes just like men do. And I think that if we are to start this talk of who should have the right to participate in these processes of decision making, who has the right to space, who has the right to the city, then at what time do we cross that line, that point of no return? And I think that's somewhat dangerous discussion, because we're risking to roll back, because quite recently women couldn't even pay taxes. So these are my thoughts. Well, with taxes, it's a topic for a separate, very large talk, and most likely it will happen, because it's not a question of why people don't pay taxes in its connection to fairness, but excluding people based on property value, like from the concept of right to the city, will not be fair. Thank you very much to all participants. Thank you to our esteemed, wonderful speakers. I now have to stop our today's discussion because we have come to the time limit, but we're stopping it, we're only putting it on stop. We're not stopping it. This is just the beginning of the project, and I very much expect that every one of the topics that we touched upon and subjects will continue developing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I also have a brief announcement, if I may. Those who want to stay updated with publications, with further activities, wants to be involved in all the projects, please scan this and you can leave your email. But once again, when it comes to protection of data, you can put it on paper and give it to me if you don't want to show your email. Now, through this email, we'll have information, updates, invites to events. We will have questionnaires. So please become involved. And thank you very much for being so active today. We have lunch served on the first floor. Please come there. You can take a bite and then continue discussion